Hi there. Today I want to deconstruct and reconstruct this style of drawing. When browsing through our school's online exhibition a couple of years ago, I noticed this student's work. When I looked at it first, I thought, wow, this is extremely cohesive and really easy to take in. So that got me wondering, how did they actually do it? So I tried to recreate this style myself. Rhino 7 has the ability for you to capture an area of the screen, so Windows key Shift S, and then to paste it within Rhino, Control V. And from there I made some notes. To my eye, this looks like a 3D scene with surfaces, polysurfaces, and closed polysurfaces. For example, the brick veneer here, that would be a closed polysurface, and you can see the edges, the black edges. There are edges across this scene, for example at the windows and around the edges of this awning. There are also black edges around this fence cladding element, edges around the seats and around the benches. So there are lots of edges to surfaces and closed polysurfaces. These can be extracted for a Make 2D. Then there are textured materials. I think that this ground pavement, each one of these planks, the planks on the ground here, this brickwork, they are all materials with custom color textures. Likewise up here, this Fletcher Bond brick pavement, I believe, is also a material. They may have created this material themselves, or they may have found it. The materials also appear to have self-illumination, or a low level of ambient occlusion. When looking at the people and the vegetation elements, there are two considerations. How is it created and how is it placed in the image? To answer the first question, I think that they could have been hand-drawn with pencil, scanned in, and then filled in either Illustrator or Photoshop. I can think of two ways that these elements, the people and the vegetation, may have been placed in this image. The first way is basically cutting out stencils and placing them in the Rhino model. Let's say this woman, she appears to be sitting on this bench, so she may have been placed at a height where she appears to sit, and she's being hidden by these plants. She's also in front of the plants behind, and the plants behind are behind this brick seating element. So placing elements within your Rhino model will save time because you don't need masking. However, that comes with its own complications. The other way that this may have been done is to have the stencils made in Photoshop or in Illustrator, to drag them as you think they would look good, and then to mask out the parts you don't want to be seen. So for example, this tree, I would want to mask out the bottom parts of this branch so that they appear behind these plants. The appearance of elements is also determined by layer order. If I've rendered out the basic building elements and then try to place these elements within the scene, the layer order also determines how they appear. But then issues arise like this. When looking at the qualities of the image itself, I think that it's quite colourful, light and bright. There is ray traced shading from the sun, slight ambient occlusion, reflection in the windows, glow from artificial lighting on the inside, and the people are quite stylized with their expressions. I had a little go at recreating a small part of this scene in Rhino. This is a perspective camera, and both the camera point and the target point are placed at the same elevation to keep the verticals vertical. That elevation is about eye height for someone standing on the ground. As analysed earlier, I tried to recreate the elements in this scene. Self-illuminated surfaces with custom coloured textures, such as this stone pavement, this brick pavement, garden bed, awning, and cladding. Or areas which needed black edges, such as these fence planks, these ground planks. So I created individual surfaces for each one of these planks. There are two surfaces here, and each one of them has a slightly different look. I created two custom materials, and each one of them has a different color texture. Both of these materials also have self-illumination checked, so they don't cast or receive shadows. I created this element here in Illustrator, and within the material, I go down to color, click it, and assign that JPEG which was created in Illustrator. It has been assigned to mapping channel 1, so that if I change the size of the surface, the texture is transformed as well. To recreate this gradient in what I think is a garden bed, instead of using Illustrator, I created another custom material, and for the color component of that material, click the three ellipses, choose from more texture types, gradient texture, and then within the gradient texture, you can change the gradient type, which I changed to box, and you can choose the colors. It's also been assigned as mapping channel 1, so that in this instance, because the repetition is only 1, it fits the surface completely. The material itself also has self-illumination. Both pavement surfaces and the brickwork surface have custom materials and custom color textures. For the bricks, I generated them in Rhino using hatches. I created a black hatch background and randomized some darker bricks and some lighter bricks. Both of the brick colors were sampled from the original image, and a percentage of them were selected to be darker. I copied this into Photoshop and cropped it to that blue square and exported it as a JPEG. This JPEG here was a brown tile on white backing, one full at the bottom, two halves to either side at the top, and that means when it's repeated square after square, you get the Fletcher Bond appearance. All the materials have self-illumination. And the textures have either been mapped as WCS-OCS box style or mapping channel. You can set the size, and when you change the size, so for example if I make it 2000, you'll see that the effect doubles in size. I cut out these stencils, the vegetation and the people, and placed them within the model. There are a few steps to the process. The first is you import a raster picture. You also import a curve, which is the outline of the object. You line up the curve over that picture element, and then using the split command you take the curve to separate that stencil out from the background. You now have a surface which has a material. The material is either a picture with a texture of the original image, or it's a custom material with the original image attached to the color component. The next step is slightly unintuitive. You take the original surface, you go to the Properties tab, you go down across to the Texture Mapping tab, you select the UV editor, you select the object again, press Enter, drag out a window, and press Apply. What this does is this applies a custom UV mapping to the surface, which may help later on during the rendering process. In the rendering process using Rhino cycles, on a couple of occasions I have found that the cutout surface completely lost its original positioning from the original image. It would try to compress the whole image into that one cutout surface. Applying that custom mapping should help to prevent that scenario. For this tutorial, I simply traced over the original images to get these components. For the vegetation elements, I traced over them in Illustrator, but for the person, I traced over in Rhino using curves, curve boolean, and hatches. I prefer Rhino as a curve creating program. I find it much quicker. You could even take an image from the internet like this PNG and do an image trace, expand, Control-Shift-G to ungroup it, deselect, select the black and delete, select those elements, create a black outline. Now you have a vector graphic. But it doesn't really matter because what we're importing into Rhino is a raster image anyway. So you can source the image from anywhere, so long as you have the outline curve, which you can create in Rhino, to cut it out as a stencil. If I'm working in Illustrator, to create the outline path, what I did was created a duplicate of the original graphic, hold Alt and drag, and for this example here, I go to the Pathfinder tab and click Unite, and I get a single outline. For this graphic here though, we've got a combination of curves and fills. So what I want to do is I want to take that, duplicate it, and I want to select the curves themselves, go to Object, Path, Outline Stroke, and now they've become fills. So it can merge all of them together. Select it all, Unite. Now I have a single closed curve, which is the outline of the original graphic. I'm now going to export all of the individual components as JPEGs. So for example, this plant will be one JPEG and this will be another. To do that, I'm going to select all of the elements of this plant, go to the Asset Export tab and generate a single asset from the selection. So now you can see the plant up here, that will be what's exported as a JPEG. I'm going to do that for this plant here and so forth. I'm now going to check all of those assets and press export. Now let's import them into Rhino. Click, drag, picture. And please note I exported them as individual JPEGs to help prevent that issue that I was talking about earlier, where the UV mapping gets completely scrambled. If you're using Rhino 7, you can simply copy curves from Illustrator to Rhino as SVG graphics, Control-C, Control-V. If you're not using Rhino 7, you can go to File, Export, Export As, And the formats DXF, DWG, SVG and PDF Rhino can import as vector graphics. I'm now going to take these curves, line them up over the original JPEGs and scale them so that they're the right size. The actual curves in Rhino have no thickness, so when you split the picture you may get some cut out, but we're going to be doing a Make 2D later, so that thickness will be added again. Now I'm going to use a split command to cut out each of the stencils. Select the background, do the split command, for me Ctrl-Alt-X, select the curve, press OK. Here is that cutout stencil. Now again I need to go to Texture Mapping, UV Editor, select the object, press space, and then press Apply. Now it should be safe. I'm going to do that with the rest. So now we have our stencils ready to place in our scene, and that's what I've done here. To achieve this final look, there is a Photoshop file and a Make 2D overlaid in Illustrator. In Photoshop, there is an albedo or color layer, a shading layer, a reflections layer masked to the windows using this key layer. Then there's also a layer for saturation and curves layers, global and local. So let's start with the albedo, that's the color. I've set it to ray traced mode because that's the best color. I've got two rectangular lights which are beaming down from above these lamps to give the wall illumination. And I've got the option to engage NVIDIA denoiser to reduce the noise from the cycles, but it's a bit unstable, so I'm not going to use it. I'm going to do view capture to clipboard, and I'm going to set it at the viewport's aspect ratio, and I'm going to do 1.5 times resolution at 150 passes. So it'll do its thing. And now I'm going to go to Photoshop, File, New, Clipboard Size, Create, Control V. So that's the albedo. If we have a look at the original images, only select vegetation creates shading. For example, in this isometric, the student has created shading of the larger trees. But if we have a look at this image, however, there's no shading of the vegetation. The person has some shading, but I believe this was created afterwards. So to prevent the vegetation from creating shading, I'm going to select those surfaces, right-click, select Sublayer Objects, go to the Properties, and turn off Cast and Receive Shadows. For the shading itself, I'm going to go to the Display options, and then at the top, I'm going to change under the shading settings, rendering material to single color for all objects, and then choose a light gray. When I press OK and start the cycles again, you can see that everything now appears gray. I've set the sun angle as I want it, and I'm ready to capture this. I'll paste that into Photoshop, Control V, and then I'm going to set that to be in multiply mode. Next up is the windows. So I've activated the windows, but they're a metal instead of glass to give stronger reflections. Go back to ray traced mode, and you can see the reflections in the window frames. Now I paste that in Rhino, and I'm changing that to reflections. To mask out the reflections, I'm going to use a custom display style. This custom display style, the only thing that's special about it is that there is no lighting and that each object uses the color of the layer that it's on. So I'm going to view capture this, press OK, paste this in Rhino, and now I can, using the select color method, sample colors, fuzziness 0, I can select this exact green, press OK, go to the reflections and create a layer mask. Turn that off, and now the reflections appear in the window. It appears too much, so I'm going to turn that down, and now we can see a bit of inside and outside. Now I'm just going to do some Photoshop touch-up. So I'm going to create a vibrance layer and a curves layer. Increase the saturation and the vibrance a bit, and adjust the curves. Brighten it up. Increase a little bit of contrast like this. To create a glow around the indoor lamps, I'm going to create a new solid color fill. I'm going to make that somewhat yellow. Set the mode to soft light. I'm going to group this with itself, and that group is going to have the same mask as the original mask. So now it's only in the windows. But I only want the glow to appear where I brush it. So I'm going to get the eraser tool, make it negative, make it soft, turn the flow up a little bit, and paint it in. So I'm now happy with this Photoshop job. Now we just need to make a 2D and combine it in Illustrator. To do a make 2D, where we have the edges of the individual objects, in Rhino I need to dupe the borders of those surfaces. So the command dupe border, and that's created a curve around the edge. And then you take all of those curves and you move them forward slightly towards the camera from the surface. Otherwise they won't show up when you do make 2D. So I'm going to go to the perspective again, select the objects I want to make 2D, and do the command. From the top view, now I'm going to export this as an Illustrator file. Open this file in Illustrator. I'm going to create a new layer underneath. This will hold the picture. So I go File, Place, and now it's just a matter of lining them up. So I'm in Illustrator, I've got my Make 2D, I've made all of the lines black, and I've got them at 1.15 millimeters, which I think is about right. And I need to line them up over the original render. The quickest way to do that for me is to line up one point that you know that is correct, like this. I know that that's at the edge of that bench, and the other point will be up here somewhere. So with a scale tool, take this little anchor point, drag it over to the point that you've already lined up, and then go over to another corner, hold shift, and start dragging outwards. I believe that now everything should be lined up perfectly, and I think that that is a very good job. Looking closer at this image, there are some things which don't add up if this was all modeled in Rhino. If you have a look at this bush here, it appears above this grass element, which appears to be closer on this slope. If you have a look at this reflection in the window, it doesn't match the vegetation which it's trying to reflect here. For these reasons, I've tried to use Photoshop and Illustrator to the same effect. As before, we have multiple elements to the Photoshop image. An albedo layer, which is just color and no shading. A shading layer, which is the ray traced render to get the directions of the shading. I've put this layer in multiply mode and lowered the opacity. I've got the make 2D edges on top of that. I've also got this reflections layer which appears in the windows and has a lowered opacity. And then I've got the vegetation and people. And lastly, I've got the keying layer, which allows me to create accurate masks which can be applied to any layers or groups. One cool thing about using vector smart objects within Photoshop is that if I resize the image by going image, image size, and then I changed the resolution, for example, to say 600, pressed OK, you can see that the Vector Smart objects are still perfectly sharp within that resolution of the Photoshop image. To bring a Vector Smart object into Photoshop from Illustrator, you simply drag it into Photoshop and let go. Then press OK. This Vector Smart object has been placed within the Photoshop file. So if I double click this, it'll open it as a new Vector Smart object within Illustrator, and I can create independent adjustments from the original file. For example, if I squish it down like this and press save, Ctrl S, the smart object updates in Photoshop. If I create a simple copy of this object by dragging and holding Alt, and I affect one of the layers and save, both objects will update because they're referencing the same file. However, if I right click the object and go to New Smart Object by Copy, and then do the same thing, double click the icon, it'll open it up as a new Illustrator file embedded within the Photoshop file. Instead of it being called Object 7, it's called Object 7.1. I can do a transformation like this, press save, and only this one will update. For the Make 2D component, I simply dragged the Illustrator contents into the Photoshop file and scaled it as before by putting a point at a known corner, placing the anchor point at that point, and then changing the percentage until it fits. And then I press OK. And change the order so that it appears behind the other blocks. The good thing about using Make 2D is that if I double click it, you can see that all of the layer contents are still retained. So for example, if I wanted to adjust the thickness of just these elements up here, I could select those layer contents and bring it down to, I don't know, 0.06 mils. Press save, and you can see that the lines have just become thinner in Photoshop. To make accurate masks, that's why we have the color key layer. In Rhino, make sure all of the objects are on colorful layers so that you can make easy selections and there are no two things which have the same color touching each other. We want to be able to separate the depth. So you can see that, for example, this pink bench element here clearly stands out from the green, the blue, and the things behind it. However, it's the same color as up here. So if I selected this and pressed OK, I may have to get the marquee tool and deselect that top part from the selection before I create the mask. For example, for this tree, I wanted it to be behind this building and behind this bench. So I go to the keying layer, go to Select, Color Range, and then I select that black background and have a fuzziness of 0 or 1, very close, and it will give me that clean selection. Then, if I would like, I could create a group and apply a mask to that group so that whatever is in that group, such as this big tree, it'll be hidden by the mask of that group. For this person at the front, they simply appear at the front with no mask. For the shadow, I created a unique copy of the person, and if I open this in Illustrator, I converted it to one black object. In Photoshop, then it's simply a matter of transforming this object to be from this shape down to a shape which represents the shadow at the time of the day. So for example, I know that the sun is coming down from the top left down to the bottom right, so I've adjusted that shadow accordingly. This person up here, however, I wanted them to be a bit darker so that it looked like they were indoors. So I created a unique copy of that in Illustrator. I did the recolor artwork and did the global adjust to make it a little bit darker and saved that out. When I placed this person behind this mask, you could see that they were hidden by the framing elements so it looked like they're indoors. The person is also below the reflections layer, so that it appears that the reflections are above them, and it gives it one further element of realism. So that's the end of this long tutorial. I learned a lot myself when creating it, and the software crashed a lot of times, especially when rendering with ray tracing. Cycles isn't particularly stable. A lot of time was lost with the UV map editing, so always save your file before you do anything big so that you can easily return to it without having to redo things. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below telling me your thoughts, your queries, and whether you'd like to see another tutorial like this. Please give it a like, consider subscribing and sharing with your friends. Cheers!